Ladies and gents, welcome back. We're on to the second part of our lecture / podcast series with Dr. Paul Taylor. And we're going to be looking at narcissistic social disorder. And we're going to start by looking through some images. First one is going to be Caravaggio's Narcissus. Thank you for joining us again today, Dr. Taylor.
Hi,
We're
Richard.
carrying on from where we left off last week for a little bit of a recap, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get our favorite friend, the most beautiful Greek hunter alive, Mr. Narcissus
Narcissus.
himself.
For viewers of a certain age, they might remember an episode of Seinfeld where he tried wearing some pirate top. He thought it was quite fashionable and I had big puffy sleeves.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing down the high culture slightly by making a reference to Seinfeld, but it always reminds me when I look at this.
Yeah, those are some billowing shirts he's got going on there, and a jazzy little waistcoat as well, which I'm not sure how ancient and Greek that is, but we'll let it slide.
Right, so we looked at this last week, and the key takeaway message that what I was trying to emphasize was the circularity of the image, and how there's the knee in the middle is the pivotal point, and it looks like a circle, and that represents, for our purposes, if you think of Narcissus as the self-enclosed servo mechanism, whereby he's looking at his image and his image is looking back, and there's no relationship to the external world. So there was the image we also looked at, which was John Waterhouse, which included a very attractive echo nymph who was to the left of the Narcissus figure, looking at him longingly. And that is an obvious example of how Narcissus would be situated in a world that he is choosing to ignore or is incapable of paying attention to. So you can see in terms of so many elements of that. A, there's another person in the picture. B, there's actually perspectival depth in the painting. And at this point, I'm sorry to interrupt myself before you interrupt me, but it would, I think for viewers, I just want to get some full disclosure. I have an active interest in cultural history, art history, but I'm not a professional art historian, which luckily I'm going to give some background to all the images we look at. But just to emphasize, that's not my key concern. It's not art history, which is fascinating in and of itself. But the whole reason you and I were going to look at these images was to find out how we could make it relevant to the relationship between the concept of narcissism and how narcissism fits in with a wider social context. And the images I'm going to discuss with you, they're all designed to do that. Rather than we could spend hours just, who painted it, when was it painted, what materials were used, which is classical art history type focus. But you can just imagine there's going to be someone online going, he didn't say where it was from and who painted it and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, people are going to whinge on the internet no matter what you do. So
Yeah.
I
So,
think
but
we we'll let that happen.
just to prove those whingers are whinging, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to do something different. But I will use technical artistic terms from my amateur, knowledge of art. But you can obviously, you don't have to be an expert to see in the background, there's a sense of perspectival depth. On the right-hand side, as we look at it, you can see the river flowing, which obviously gives a sense of depth. And unless my, aging eyesight is wrong, I think on the right-hand side in the gap between the trees, you can see, is it a mountain or hills?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, just there.
A hill.
So that all adds to a sense of depth. Now, if we go back to the Caravaggio, it's so obvious. You don't have to be a trained art historian to work out. I think you pointed out last week that is completely self-enclosed. That is completely depthless. The only sense of any depth in that painting, interestingly, is the vertical one as Narcissus looks down on himself. And then the perverted Freudian, the coming out of the knee like a huge big phallus right in your eye line and poked in the eye by it. So, but there's no backward depth. Would you agree? It's completely flat.
Yes, it's flat. There's no perspective. What did you call it? Perspective depth?
Perspectival depth. We can do it.
Perspectival.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because everything's fascinating to me because I'm a nerd. But we can do in 1 week. I can show you how what we look at pictures in 3D and we just think that's completely natural and normal. In the Middle Ages, they used to paint completely flatly, and the size of objects was dependent upon their religious importance. So an angel or a human being would have a different size, not because they were trying to do an accurate portrayal, but because in a medieval worldview, the angel was more important. So what I'm calling perspectival distance and perspective. It's interesting. We use the phrase it's just a perspective, but in artistic terms, the way in which we see in 3D, I can show you the diagrams at a later time. But you can trace it was Brunelleschi, who was an architect and artist, and others in the Italian Renaissance who developed the technique. And I can show you early Renaissance paintings where because they weren't adept at it yet, they've actually got the perspective wrong. So this idea that perspective is a completely naturalized way of looking, it's naturalized because of what we previously discussed as the concept of an episteme. We have grown up in a Western artistic culture where we are used to we've been trained to see things in 3D.
So let's just keep this simple and keep recapping for people who are tuning in. Why is it significant, the difference between the Caravaggio and the Waterhouse picture, and how is it relevant to the overall theme of what we'll be discussing here?
Because the things I'm mentioning about, in one, there's a horizontal distance involved that isn't here, and there's a perspectival depth that is in the other picture that isn't here. This all goes to emphasize how this painting, that's got depth, it's got breadth. The Caravaggio has no depth apart from actually what comes out at you or what goes down vertically within the picture. But in terms of backward depth, there's nothing. And that emphasizes the way in which what you're getting from that picture is circularity. And I was making the claim. So you asked a question last week, which was basically, tell me if I got it wrong, I made the claim in a post-literate society, which I think we effectively are, we spend all our time looking at images. There are profound social consequences to that. So the clinical use of the word narcissistic personality disorder, I'm leaving to you. But what I'm talking about is I'm basing all my ideas on the actual original myth.
Please
right.
continue.
So you asked in the last video, you asked about my claim that, well, I was making the claim that in a post-literate society, there are profound social consequences. And you're asking me, well, to expand on that. And what I'm suggesting here is this picture, the circularity, the lack of depth, is a visual representation of the type of, now you're using, in most of your talks, you're using a clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder. And I don't want to broach on that because that's not my area. I know nothing about the type of thing. But the point of these videos and my claim, and we'll find out whether it's nonsense or true or whether you find any resonance with it, is that forgetting the clinical definition, I'm not saying it's not important at all. I'm just saying moving that to one side and looking at it from a cultural point of view. In art history and in literature, and hopefully we'll get onto literature in the future weeks, but in art history and in literature, there are various engagements with this original myth of Narcissus. And the myth, I'm fascinated by myth because it's inherently ambiguous. And in most religious traditions, well, maybe it's because Islam and Christianity and Judaism are by far the most dominant religions in the world, I'd suggest. Maybe I've left out Buddhism. But in those three major religions, at least, there is one God and there is one type of law or way of behaving or canon. There's canonicity in religious texts of how we're supposed to behave, and there's one port of authority, which is a single, or I know there's a trinity, but there's an idea of one God basically. Now, in the Greek myths, there were many gods, and they were contrary sods. They do all sorts. They weren't predictable. And I think I mentioned last week, one of the few rules that the Greek gods had was you don't reverse something another god has done. And that was about it. They got up to all sorts, and they were largely irrational, very difficult to read. And I would suggest that meant Greek culture was very comfortable with the concept of ambiguity. That they'd projected it onto their founding myths and the way they thought about the world. Now, remember last week, I think I pointed out the Delphic oracle. The first axiom above the door was know thyself. The second axiom was nothing to excess. And the third axiom was surety or certainty leads to ruin. And in a Greek context, this meant that you sought to know yourself. You didn't obviously overdo things, but this crucial idea of you didn't necessarily seek certainty. We've seen the previous picture where there's breadth, and on the left-hand side, you have the nymph Echo, and on the right-hand side, you have Narcissus. And there's perspectival depth. You can see in the distance, river, mountain. So you've got that sense of Narcissus is placed in the world. In this picture, Narcissus is an entity only unto himself. And the only distance you've got is the vertical distance going down and the knee that comes out at the viewer. In the background, there's no sense of depth whatsoever. It's murky, it's dark, it's unapproachable. So the contrast between those two pictures, it should be clear. I use the word clear, but you can see there it's completely murky. But there's a good contrast between those two images to show that Narcissus could be in the world, or in this instance, he's a completely self-enclosed servo mechanism.
So there's a view of Narcissus where he's in the world, and then there's a view of Narcissus that's the Waterhouse Narcissus with the bare-breasted nymph, cheeky nymph. And then we have this much darker, much more depressing, pessimistic view that it is a completely self-enclosed loop.
Yeah, and my claim was that we live in a post-literate society, and to some extent, this is a representation. And viewers will think, why it's a visual image? What's this got to do with literacy? Which is the main theme I want to talk about in this video. Just for the easiest way to think of this is a point you made last week. I think at one point you picked up your mobile phone and looked at it to replicate this idea of circularity. In the modern world, there's you on Instagram, there's you looking at your phone, and there's just images going backwards and forwards between you and your screen. This is an age-old representation based upon the original Greek myth, but put into Caravaggio's Renaissance art of the same idea, just instead of a mobile phone screen, what you've got is the shimmer of the water. Now, you might think it's a great leap from the shimmer of the water to looking at screens, but I'd argue, is it really? Because Narcissus in this picture is transfixed. He's fascinated. And one of the interesting things about the original Greek myth is it's one of the few myths, if any, whereby the theme of vision isn't mentioned in the context of the notion of the evil eye. So in Greek culture and across, I think in Turkey and places like that, I believe it's in Turkey that if you see anyone with blue eyes, which would include me, there are little tokens you can give of an eye. Because people with blue eyes are perceived to have the evil eye, and you can give them back an eye, which is supposed to insulate you. They're like little candies that look like an eye. So there's in lots and lots of in nature, bizarrely, there are insects and animals that have fake eyes as part of their camouflage or in order to confuse or transfix prey. So in actual practical terms, all animals seem to be fixated or fascinated or sometimes petrified by the concept of an eye. So this concept of being transfixed, the point of this picture is Narcissus is not open to the world around him. He's not interacting. He's not open to his environment. And I mentioned last week the idea of seeing a couple of teenagers just constantly photographing each other. And my point is, are they really living in the moment? Every viewer will have their own personal, relationship with watching either their loved ones sitting at a meal. They're supposed to be having a nice meal, and the person's on their mobile phone, or looking across in a restaurant. You see people on their mobile phone, or at football matches in Britain, people have spent God knows how much on a ticket, 80, 90 pounds for the whole day, whatever. And they're in the middle of the match while it's live, texting people, which I know you're not that into your sport, but if you can explain to me the idea of people not being able to be in the moment anymore without this screen of a mobile phone. So that's the point. Narcissus isn't in the moment because of this screen, which happens to be the water surface, but it's just a standard part of contemporary life that people are no longer in the moment. So up to this point, does that all make sense to you? Are you buying the analysis and the comparison I'm making with modern day life?
Yeah, it's interesting.
So if I asked you, what would be your understanding about the concept if I just used the phrase desire?
Desire.
Yeah, but just the phrase desire, how would you define it, or what does it mean to you?
Um, well, for me, it would get filtered through Buddhism. It would be tahana. It's a craving. It's a unfulfilled craving, lust and appetite for something that you haven't yet had.
So in a second I'll talk about the unfulfilled is probably what I'll focus on. But there's a beautiful Jacques Lacan is a very complicated psychoanalyst, but he had a lovely phrase where he said I think one of his definitions of desire was giving something you don't have to someone who doesn't need it. And in some ways, the whole Narcissus thing is about the concept of desire because he's desiring himself. But in basic psychoanalysis, the idea of the mirror stage. Yeah. So for viewers, there's a concept of, and I don't think it particularly matters if it's actually strictly true, but Jacques Lacan had this concept that when a baby is between 6 and 18 months, they can see their reflection, although they begin to engage with a mirror. And I think the first stage of the mirror interaction is there's the baby and, for argument's sake, the mother. And the baby in stage one isn't aware of the difference between itself and the mother. It just sees images in the mirror. The second stage is that the baby realizes the reflections aren't real. And then the third stage is the baby realizes the difference between the two images and that they're not the mother and the mother isn't them. So they're beginning to get a sense of their selfhood. Now, the point is that the mirror stage for the baby is to realize that you're not this one unit with your mother, where all you need is a breast to feed on, and that's you and your mother are the universe. So the whole point in psychoanalysis, they use the mirror stage to discuss the way in which we evolve as individuals. We learn to be ourselves. But Narcissus, when you in that image, he's going backwards. So if you think of a baby that he's focusing, he's going out after the mirror stage. So when the baby's finally realized what it is itself in the mirror, this is all pre-verbal. This is before the baby can speak. And then after that stage comes verbosity, which I've overdone on apparently in life. But the baby learns to speak. And language is the neutral space in which you as an individual engage with the external world. You move beyond the simple image of yourself in a mirror. Yeah.
Yes. And you're saying that he's actually regressing.
Yeah,
in his
exactly.
infantilism, in his psychological brokenness. He's moving back into childhood.
Yeah, if you the original myth, he's wandering through the forest. Everyone fancies him. He ends up in this pond, and then he's sinking down into non-verbal self-obsession. So it's human psychological development in reverse.
The interesting thing about that as it relates to social media is that the mirroring phase, whether it's actually a mirror or people as mirror, it's all reactions based. So it entrains you into reactions focused communication, which is exactly what social media is.
Yeah.
Exactly what it is. You're only going to post. You don't post for yourself. You post for the reactions of other people. So social media has, and I've never thought of this until you just said it, the most primitive, formative phase of our selfhood baked into the source code, which is it takes us back to the mirroring phase. How do people react to me? Do they tell me I'm a good object in psychoanalytic sense, or a bad object, or an irrelevant object? That's fascinating. That it's infantilizing in and of itself.
Yeah, and I'll keep circling around this key question because I ultimately think it's not like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The answer to the universe is 49, but
Yeah,
the answer to
42.
the answer to our modern problems, I would argue, is if we can convince ourselves and viewers. But I personally, I'm convinced it's this post-literate age we now live in that's reinforced by technological media, which you've just identified. And another ongoing interest you have, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you tell me in what ways what I'm saying chimes with, but you've had an ongoing interest in, I'd argue, modernity,
Yes.
how people feel
Recently,
alienated in
much more.
modernity. And then recently, I've noticed specifically, you've got this concept of our relationship to commodities. And then probably fourthly, I've noticed you've also got this. Maybe you could expand on it yourself, but the idea of, I think, didn't you say you were scared of fantasy?
Yes. Yeah. The fear that the fear that uh, we would just abandon reality. My big fear, if I go full conspiracy theorist on it, is that we will beg to enter virtual reality simulator pods. They won't be pushing us in there like in the Matrix. It was after we lost the war in that story. We were forced into these pods to be human batteries. We will queue, we will riot, we will fight to get our place in the pods because our capacity to handle reality is deteriorating year by year, week by week.
Yeah. Well, what would bring there's a whole video in a week I'd like to do with you, which would be about the social theories of all this. And just to give people forewarning, and I'll include this in the notes that I can provide for this talk. But in 1967, which was a truly blessed year because I was born then, there was a book called Society of the Spectacle by a French guy called Guy Debord, Debord. And before that, 1962, I think it's even more accessible for viewers. There was an American called Daniel Boorstin who wrote a book called The Image, and the subtitle of the book was A Guide to Pseudo Events in America. And the concept of a pseudo event is fascinating because, in Borston's definition, and it all goes to what we're talking about, the role of images in modern society, a pseudo event is defined as an event that only exists within the media. So, for example, the easiest example I could give you is a press conference.
Right.
If the media didn't exist, what would be the point of a press conference?
Right.
It's an
Yes.
event constructed purely to be reproduced within the media.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's there. There's a pornography to it. It's there for its own sake. It's there to be recorded by the media. So the media is constructing events to record so that it has content
Right.
to consume.
So do you
Yeah.
see the circularity of that?
Yes.
And to
Yes.
see that that goes straight back to the image I showed you of Narcissus, Caravaggio's Narcissus, the circularity. And
I see.
it goes to when people are using Instagram. You defined it just a few minutes ago as the idea that you're looking for likes. And we'll talk about this in a future week, hopefully, because there's the concept of the gaze, GAZE, where it's not just when you're in love, for example, there's this very hard to put into words when you get a loving look from somebody else. That's partly yourself, your best attributes being reflected back to you in the eyes of somebody else. So, does that make sense yet?
Yes, yes.
You find yourself doing things that will produce a loving look from somebody.
Huh.
And what you're seeking is some type of validation from that other person.
Yes,
And you can sometimes see it in their eyes that they're loving you. And it's because it's a part of you that they're recognizing that you've deliberately emphasized so that they will recognize it. And again, just see the circularity.
I do. Just a side note to that. It would be a mistake. This is the psychology kicking in to underestimate how incredibly powerful a force and a driver that is in human behavior. Because, and now I'll just do the evolutionary psychology thing, most likely our validity as it was perceived by the tribe would have been directly positively correlated with our survivability. And if you're not seen positively by the tribe, it would be negatively correlated with your survivability because you're fucking useless. So we get very, very depressed, like in a non-rational way. It's too much. We get too depressed when we're not receiving it, and we become exceedingly elated when we do receive a little bit of praise. I just thought I'd side note that.
Well, what I'd like to do now is try and tie all this into the concept of desire and then
Okay.
tie that into the concept of commodities.
Good luck to you.
Because, well, it's not that difficult in the sense that will tie it all together. But
Yeah.
forgive me in advance if I flip from one person I've mentioned to the other. But I'm trying to make it all make sense by getting it to refer back to each other, ironically, a bit like
Yes.
Narcissus going around in a circle.
Yeah.
But in the Boston book, for example, he's defined pseudo event as something that only has meaning within the media itself. But if you think of celebrities, I think his definition of a celebrity is someone who's well known for being well known.
Right.
So it's rare. There was a time where celebrities, and this has been traced by a guy called Leo Lewenthal in the I think he looked at magazine articles in the 1920s and 30s, and he wrote an essay called Idols of Production and Idols of Consumption. And his point was, at one point in time, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts in America, famous people, were famous for having produced things. They'd build things, they'd make things, they'd be incredibly successful business people. And then there's an identifiable period in American history where Babe Ruth and baseball players or film stars became famous. And the point is, and they became associated with commodities. It was all very closely related. So if you see a famous film star smoking a certain brand of cigarette, you
Yeah.
want that cigarette. But the point is, what is that film star? I would suggest that acting is a noble profession, but would I think you and most viewers would accept that in that society, and especially in ours, people are famous in out of all proportion to their ability.
Proportionality was the word I was looking for before, and my poor concussed brain couldn't find it. Proportionality. Is it worth mentioning? Is it Baudrillard? Is that how you pronounce his name? And
Well,
hyperreality.
I can't do the French, but a good French person would say something along the lines of Baudrillard.
Baudrillard.
Yeah.
And his concept of hyperreality, where the signifier becomes more significant than that which is signified to the point where you don't need a signified thing. You only need the signifier, and then you've entered hyperreality. Is that a correlate, do you think,
No,
for
no, it's
with
exactly. I'm talking, but it's all the same stuff. If you
right?
wanted to trace it, if viewers wanted to understand it, Baudrillard is, to some people, inaccessible. He's a French theorist, but he's talking about all of this. And if people can make the effort, I'd thoroughly recommend him. Um, Boston is probably the most accessible. And Boston wrote The Image in 1962. Baudrillard was writing in from the 70s up until he died, which I can't quite remember when, but well into the 90s he was writing.
Yeah.
In the middle of all that, there's the famous Italian author Umberto Eco, and
Yes.
he wrote a collection called Travels in Hyperreality.
Oh, I don't
So
know
if
that.
yeah, if you want to get your head around, he writes one of the essays, for example, is about, yeah, I think he picks on Las Vegas because they have simulations of the Last Supper, the painting, the fresco. And
Yeah.
in Las Vegas, they have like a VR version or they have a painted version. I'll give you a funny example of this. I remember seeing a documentary years ago and I was very young, and there was an old church in the middle of America, in the middle of nowhere. And I'm being mean because there's crass people in every society, but they painted the ceiling of this abandoned huge church in the style of the Sistine Chapel, but instead of Michelangelo's figures, they were Care Bears. But it was done in a dramatic classical style.
That's pretty cool, actually. If they followed what was there in the Sistine Chapel, I think that's pretty cool.
Except then you see Care Bears.
Yeah.
So, and it's very difficult for someone from Liverpool to go Care Bear.
Care Bear. Yeah. So as far as crassness goes, neither of us are taking the piss. We're both from Liverpool, so like
we're both diphthongally challenged, I think the phrase is. But a woman came out. It was on the film. She comes out crying, and they're saying, "And how did you know how did the fresco or the ceiling painting affect you?" And she goes, "Oh, it was amazing. It was just wonderful." And being the snob I am, I find this quite disturbing. There's also a book called I think was it in White Noise. Don DeLillo is an American, quite complicated writer. But in one of his books, I think it was a novel called White Noise, he talks about the most photographed barn in America. And it's a fictional thing, but I'm sure it happens in reality too. A barn in America, in a completely arbitrary fashion, had become famous for lots of people taking photographs.
Right.
So then people came to the barn to photograph it so they can say they'd been to the most photographed barn in America.
Right. Right.
And do you see how the circularity is self-generating?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. Oh, just as a side there, for people who are a bit scared of Guy Debord or Baudrillard, you can just look up some of their quotes, a few paragraphs from like their quote website. I just have a chew on some of their quotes and get a bit of a flavor of it. You don't have to pick up the whole book and consume the whole thing. There's also YouTube videos covering them for this is the level I come in at, Paul.
No, just to emphasize that the Guy Debord book, I think you'll probably find it available online. It's actually not written as a book. It's written, I've forgotten the number of, it's short paragraphs.
It's quite nice.
I mentioned Umberto Eco's Travels in Hyperreality because they're short essays.
Okay.
And also Umberto Eco, he wrote Name of the Rose, which is quite a famous. Book, yeah. And Sean Connery with his, inherent Scottish accent, no matter what character he was ever playing.
He's Italian, he's Spanish, he's Russian, he's Scottish the entire time.
So there's a Scottish monk, so he plays the role if anyone wants to watch the film. But Umberto Eco,
highly recommended.
Yeah, Umberto Eco is very approachable. And then while I'm on this theme, just riffing on authors that people might find accessible, I think I've mentioned it to you privately before, but there's an Italian writer called Italo Calvino.
Yeah.
And he wrote a collection in Italian, I think it's called L'amore is it Cliamori difficili? But in English, it's translated as Difficult Loves. And one essay, he does a series of essays called The Adventure of, L'Avventura di, and one of them is about a photographer. And it's online. You can find out if you look for The Adventure of a Photographer, Italo Calvino. I'll put it in the notes. But it's a beautiful short story about a guy who gets into photography. And it goes bonkers, basically. Eventually, plot spoiler, he starts taking photographs of the photographs he's taken.
Yes, yeah, you told me.
Because this is in the days where you had single reflex lenses. It's not digital. So he'd have photographs on the floor of his apartment and he'd start taking photographs of those. And it sounds mad, but he also starts taking photographs, for example, of the radiator in his apartment and then how it changes as the light changes over the day. And this all sounds, it's a short story, but actually, and again, in a future week, we might get to talk about Monet. Monet, the painter, his whole career was quite narcissistic in the sense that he became obsessed with water. And his artistic career reflected the actual myth of Narcissus, because in early Monet paintings, he's got figures in a landscape with water. And by the time he died, his last paintings I think it's the French gallery called Les Angeries, where you go in and it's a truly immersive experience because there's a panel of the water lily paintings in a semicircle. And unfortunately, I've never been in person, but from all accounts, you walk in and you feel like you're drowning. But it's the point about Narcissus's pond. It's hard to say that Narcissus, the pond of Narcissus, is what Monet was basically painting at the end. So he regressed from an artist in the world to an artist fixated. And there are images of weeping willows that merge with the water. And the point is that Monet was basically going back to the ultimate pond, the origins of life. And I can go on and on about it because it was all to do with the fact he'd had lots of tragedies in his life. And it's also about one of the positive aspects of all this is what Monet was doing, you know, this drive to keep repeating himself. It's the circularity of Narcissus. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that that image of Narcissus is always totally negative. Because the circularity, the drive to do things again and again and again. So Monet painting the same lilies or the same haystacks again and again and again. It's what very successful people, it's what literally drives them.
Yes, yes.
So Monet's doing this compulsive repetition, which, you know, may have been difficult to be around Monet, but if you actually think of the productive output and the depths of his obsession, what it actually gave the world in terms of art. So it's a slight side issue, but the degree to which creativity is premised upon what are, in terms of human interaction, may be slightly unhealthy. The fact that all Monet wanted to do was keep going into this Narcissus-like pond produced some of the greatest art we've ever seen, or some of the most profound art, at least.
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated thing about when the Narcissus character goes out into the social world. It's it's the innate human conflict between keeping your own self-identity and your sense of yourself, but interacting with others in a vaguely healthy psychological way.
Yes.
And I'm not saying anything original. It is the essence of being human.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we might develop in future talks is Sartre. We could try and make Sartre accessible to people because he's a very, very difficult writer, but he has this concept of the look. And one of the aspects of the look or the gaze that I'll hopefully talk about in a minute is the way in which, when we go back to the mirror phase, it's seeing yourself in a mirror is how the baby begins to identify. Now, the problem with what the baby sees and identifies, it's a misleadingly whole image when the baby first recognizes itself. The baby sees itself as a whole entity unto itself. Now, the baby, as it gets into the world, learns that actually it's not an all-powerful self-entity because it has to interact with this awkward entity called other people. So it's this distinction between the self and the other. Now, as obviously as adults, we just think this is what I'm stating the absolute obvious, except in psychological development terms, it's not so obvious because people have different levels of facility with interacting with other people. So again, full disclosure, I am very misanthropic. I really don't particularly like people. So I don't score highly on the affability scale. So I can maybe this is just a very clever way, Richard, of me. I think you've said this before, though, me getting therapy from you by pretending to talk about academic subjects.
The most long-winded blag for therapy I've ever seen in my life.
But this idea of the self as an entity, and Sartre's analysis is that he talks about, I've mentioned the way people look at you. And it sounds very French, but one of his theories is the concept whereby we learn of ourselves by finding out that we're not other people. So when someone looks at you as an object, you realize very intuitively that you're an object in the world, unlike when the baby sees its reflection and mistakes that for a whole entity that's the beginning and meaning of everything. Whereas when you're looked at by somebody else and when you see somebody else looking at you, so classically, for example, women have for generations justifiably complained they've been objectified, or women are turned into sex objects. It's at a lower level, that's what happens every time someone looks at you. You're turned into an object in the world.
You mean me specifically? I agree. I'm sick of it, Paul. I'm sick of it, you know.
When I walk my dogs, I have to take a big stick out with me, not for the dogs, but to beat off all my admirers. I don't think. But does this make sense, this idea that our sense of how we construct an identity is determined by often how we're looked at by other people?
I think on the point of Sartre and the other, I think I know a quote in French from Sartre about the other, and I think it's something like "L'enfer c'est les autres," which is, I think, is hell is other people.
Hell is other people, yeah. But also, it's not just hell is other people. So that's me on a train with people talking loudly into a mobile phone. In that instance, hell is other people. But also, to riff on that quote, it's not just hell is other people. Our identity is formed by the recognition of other people.
Right.
So the point that's quite complex but essential to all of this is that we think of ourselves as you'll have a sense of your own ego, not in the egotistical sense, but just what does ego mean? It means I.
Yeah.
But what does I mean?
You mean in the classic psychoanalytic Freudian sense, which is healthy. It's essentially healthy.
Selfhood. One way of thinking of this is there's a difference between being selfish and self-centered. Oh, interestingly, I think it was a guy called Reuben Fine, who's a fascinating writer. He was a chess grandmaster and a psychoanalyst. So he did a very funny book about chess, which was about wanting to kill your father. So anyone who's interested in chess, that you're suffering an Oedipal thing, whereby you're trying to kill your father because you're trying to.
And the pawns being excessively protective of the queen because they want to boink.
No, the king. Checkmate is killing the king.
Yeah.
So, but Reuben Fine, he distinguishes between selfish and self-centered, and he said he prefers selfish people, or not automatically, but he says he's met very selfish people in his life who he said are much easier to deal with than self-centered people. And what he means by that is there are selfish people who if you know they're selfish, you can make allowances for that and work around it. There are self-centered people who, even when they're doing good or helping you, are doing it in a self-centered way to make themselves feel better. And he said he would prefer to deal with the selfish people who he knows won't go out their way to help him, but then he knows what he's going to get from them, as opposed to dealing with someone who's self-centered, who does something nice for him, but the psychological payback is so high because he has to be grateful and show that he's grateful. And then it becomes a whole performance.
What you're describing is eerily similar. It's kind of echoed by the definition between a classic grandiose narcissist who is placatable and then the covert or vulnerable narcissist who you cannot placate. You cannot placate. One's manipulatable and the other one you can try, but ultimately you'll be exhausted.
Right, so we're going in a big cycle, so I'm going to try and bring it back. So when I talked about Daniel Boorstin, when you talk about hyperreality, excuse me, I would argue that all this self-referentiality, all this the hyperreal, all this pseudo events that take place within the media, and remember, all of this is premised upon the image of Narcissus, the circularity of seeing yourself feeding back. The Sartre point I'm making is a different point. That's when you're seen from the outside. So that's like, in terms of the original images we were looking at, when Echo looks at Narcissus, that's a healthier, socialized interaction. But Narcissus isn't looking back. Narcissus is looking at himself. If
Yeah.
Narcissus could get his head up and look at Echo, that would be, and that's how the whole myth starts off. And he gradually
Mm.
moves away from anyone who admires him until he only admires himself. But what is enabling this is, rather than having a world in which we interact, admittedly in complex ways, as Sartre writes about, in the media world, it's producing the environment much more similar to that experienced by Narcissus. And how does it do that? So, I've spoken at length, but let's get down to brass tacks. How does this happen? Well, with things like celebrities, with things like commodities, because what a celebrity and a commodity, and arguably a celebrity is a commodity in human form. What we see within the media, in social media, we increasingly see ourselves or people close to us or celebrities that we want to be like, or our images are thrown out there to seek likes, like you've pointed out. We're grasping at recognition from others, but the media packages all this. So, how would you define it to try and develop this? How would you define the concept of a commodity?
It has to be well, it has to overlap with Marx's concept of capital. It needs to be something that is consumable. It must come from excess and commodity. Yeah, consumable good.
The angle I'd take on it, yeah, it has to be consumed. But what's interesting is it's the difference between at extremes. I'm obsessed with food, and I haven't had my lunch yet, so
Oh dear.
we should leave this. But if you think of a classical sit down meal at a non-franchised restaurant. So, for example, I've spent a bit of time in Italy, and I think it's for economic reasons that people tend to own old establishments more than us. We tend to rent them out in Britain, but a
Mm.
family can own an establishment. So there are many more family-run restaurants. In Britain or America, it tends to be more franchise-based because you're having to rent space and you've got to make a lot of money. And the difference, I would argue, you get great meals in a franchise place, but there's an element of, in order to be a franchise, it has to be predictable. Because you go to the family Italian restaurant, you don't know what you're going to get.
No.
And that's both the beauty for someone who's a greedy pig like me. I don't know what I'm going to get. And I'm quite experimental in my food tastes. I like
Yeah.
that. But if you're tired or you're in a different town and you want something predictable, you go to a franchise. So what you're saying about a commodity being consumable, it's consumable in a predictable fashion.
Fascinating. That's how all major corporations really flourish if they're producing consumable items. It's not that it's an amazing item, it's
No.
that it's predictable. The BMW is a predictable drive. The Starbucks that Dr. Paul Taylor is a terrible coffee snob and he calls Starbucks Charbucks, but it's predictable. It's predictable.
Well, can I expand on that, please?
You may.
Thank you.
Lunch holiday.
I'm overcompensating. I'm trying to make up for all the times I've rudely interrupted you.
It's fine.
Um, no,
Blame the
but
coffee.
Charbucks and allegedly people call it that because my lawyers will fight this in court. But it's interesting because if viewers will indulge me just for a second, I want to give a very specific example of the process we're talking about, whereby commodities are based upon predictability, because I actually think it's a crucial point that then you can expand to the world of images. So coffee, if I'm so pretentious, I still do occasionally roast my own coffee beans. And pretentious?
May
What?
the good Lord guide and protect you, sir.
You
Sorry.
haven't tasted my coffee yet, though. And the point is, when you get the beans, that the beans are green. So when you see roasted beans, they're dark brown. Now, it's interesting from a commodified point of view. If Illy, the Italian makers, they market their beans. You know, they've got silver and red tins. You'll recognize it, and there's a very famous Illy
Yes,
brand image.
it's very
When
recognizable.
they,
Yeah.
yeah, when they advertise them, I think especially espresso beans. If you ever picture those Illy beans, they tend to be bathed in oil. They've got a sheen on them. Yeah, they're quite. They all almost look wet.
Shiny, yeah, shiny
Yeah.
beans.
Well, that shininess is actually the polyphenol oils and the where all the aromas and taste and goodness in the bean that's oozing out of the bean. So they're selling you beans that look good,
Mm.
whereas a perfectly roasted bean has little pinpricks of that oil just on the surface waiting to come out when you make it. So you're consuming an illy bean that looks wonderful, but
Mm.
actually it can't be as tasty as it should be.
It's because
So
of the
that's
flavors being bled out.
yeah. But why are they doing that? Because it looks beautiful in adverts and it looks to
Right.
the eyes when you first undo the tin. It looks appealing. So
Yes.
that's one aspect, how things look. But Starbucks, what they do, and other chains, other awful chains are available. Any mainstream coffee chain, when they get the green beans, when I roast them myself, it's called first and second crack. And
Mm.
what it is when the beans are roasting, physically, when they get to a certain point, it's like twigs breaking. You hear a crackling sound. And that's the sign that a certain amount of moisture has left the bean. When you keep roasting, if you hear second crack, that is the point at which you decide how dark you're going to roast the bean and
Mm.
how much oil comes out. So if you're very good, and for example, you want a certain type of flavor, you can guess when second crack's about to happen. And for argument's sake, 10 seconds before you stop roasting, or you go 10 seconds or 15 seconds past second crack. And this will allow you in any given bean that you have, certain beans are better consumed for taste profile in a particular way, either before or after second crack. Now, because every time Starbucks or any of these other franchises get a big consignment of green beans, if they really wanted you to have the best cup of coffee possible, they'd ascertain what type of beans they were that particular season or what part of the world they're from and would roast it according to what would bring out the best in that particular bean. So one bag of beans, they might do 10 seconds under second crack. Another bag, they might do 10 seconds over. And
Mm-hmm.
that would give you the best possible cup of coffee from that bean.
Mm.
But that would be, to use a colloquial phrase, a ball ache.
And the tired, disinterested 22-year-old who's serving you doesn't want to do that.
Well, yeah, they don't have to roast them, but the point is, not just would it be inconvenient to have to do because you'd have to pay
Mm.
attention to the roasting process,
Right.
but also, this is what's interesting. Every time you went into a Starbucks, you wouldn't quite know the flavor of the coffee you were going to get.
Mm.
Even though if they did it my preferred way, it would be better every time.
Mm.
And this is where consumers themselves are to blame. We say we want certain things, but ultimately, often people want predictability. They don't want to
Oh, yeah.
take a chance.
No.
And that's a key part of commodities that you're consuming in an eminently predictable fashion.
I wanted to mention on the same subject. I used to do self-defense videos. I used to create physical DVDs and then send them out in the post. And a friend of mine who's also a martial artist, he helped me to do them. So he was there for the shoots, and he was like, "How many times are you going to release a DVD that says the same thing before your clients get really angry with you?" And I'm like, "They don't want me to say anything else." This is how The Simpsons has had so many episodes, and it's still going strong as this huge, multi-million, probably billion-dollar franchise. Is the predictability. You want the same. You don't, as human beings, we think we're adventurous and we want different, but we really want reliable. We want that predictability.
Yeah. And it's but arguably the circularity of the Narcissus character, and the way in which, and what I'm suggesting is the commodities replicate that circularity. So
Mm.
what you see is what you get, and you don't have to look to the side where Echo is calling you, because you know what you're going to get, which is a reflection of what you want, which is yourself.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, well, you can take this as slowly as you want, but what I just said, what I'm suggesting is, I'm comparing the Italian restaurant to Echo in the original painting we looked at.
Mm.
The bare-chested nymph Echo, she's looking at you. She's the Italian restaurant that says, you don't know what you're going to get here, but boy,
Mm.
it could be fun. And then you've got Narcissus saying, oh, I know what I like and I like what I know. And he's going to have a Big Mac.
Oh,
And
that's like those bloody people who go to Spain and order fish and chips.
yes, yes, exactly. Because they
Sorry,
know
it
what
wasn't
they
that you
like.
did a Leeds accent that made me think of people like that. That would be defamatory. I just wanted to bring it up. Dr. Paul Taylor is a friend and colleague of Slavoj Žižek, who you'll have heard me mention on the channel, and was the editor and publisher for the Slavoj Žižek Studies paper
International
for
Journal of Zizek Studies.
International Journal of Žižek Studies. You founded it, and then you edited it for how many years were you doing that?
Quite a while, then I handed my good colleague David Gunkel, is in the process of getting a new editor.
And Paul's already heard this story, and some of you will have done, but I actually got the joy of meeting Slavoj Žižek before a Birkbeck University lecture in Starbucks, drinking a stupid Starbucks coffee, a cup of pure ideology. And he was very Slavoj Žižek about the whole thing. It was wonderful. So back to that circularity thing, you're saying our human drive for predictability and the desire for commodities that are predictable rather than good or high quality is affirming this circularity, which draws us back in our development into infantilism.
Yeah, and I'm not actually claiming, because I'm not sure it's chicken and egg. And I think Marshall McLuhan said a chicken is an egg's way of producing more eggs. Just to further complicate the chicken and egg
That's the
analogy.
kind of thing, if I was on acid, I'd be stuck on that for 3 hours.
Well, that's like a Buddhist koan, isn't it?
Yeah, it
It's
is.
just
It's really good.
you just go. But that's the point about circularity. That's the point I'm trying to make. The definition of circularity is you go around in circles.
Have
But
you
I've
have
just
you heard
reversed the circle by talking
you
about the egg, trying to get more eggs through the chicken.
and you're familiar with Dawkins' 80s selfish gene theory
Yeah.
that
Well, you
we're
said
just
no. No, no.
go
What I
on.
want to dive in here is I'm not. I don't think it's. I'm not sure. It's a whole other realm. I'm not claiming that people are necessarily the drivers of this circularity and they want what they think they know. There's an element of people, but capitalism is premise, and this is where I think some of your more recent work is concentrated on.
Yeah.
Capitalism is designed to stimulate our desire for predictability.
Yes. Now, um, without me jumping all over the map, you taught me a concept that's called how do we how is it that in different periods of history we understand the world that we're in? It's our reality.
Epistemes.
Epistemes are from epistemological. And whose concept is this?
This is what will eventually, when we look at
Uh,
Las Meninas, that's what epistemes are all about.
okay.
So epistemes, the
Oh,
basic definition of an episteme is in any period of history, and they change from time to time. So we don't think like the ancient Greeks thought.
and we
Why is
can't.
that?
We
No.
can't. Can we? No.
But why is that? Because we live in a different historical period, which is an obvious statement. But what does a different historical period mean? People don't
Mm.
tend to think about that. A different historical period means the way in which we experience and look at the world is profoundly different. Like previous human beings, we all eat, we all meet other people, we all do basic human things. But that's a relatively, once you get into advanced civilizations, that's a relatively small element of what we do as people. And what we do as people in a culture is determined by that culture. in ways that we tend to think whatever is our dominant culture, we tend to think is natural.
Yes. And the reason I made a point of saying we can't access it is there's a very dangerous and revolutionary idea here dormant within this epistemes concept, which is things that we have today that we think we know, we couldn't possibly know. Ancient Greek, just take the ancient Greeks, the ancient Greek pantheon and their religion. I was taught it as though it was a form of Christianity. These were the gods, these are the goddesses, and the Greeks believed in them. I think I was 40 before I went back to it, and I was like, the Greeks weren't stupid. They can't have naively believed. It was actually the Egyptians I thought of first. These are not gods as we have gods. These are gods as mnemonics for concepts or myth or psychology or something else. Does that make sense, or does that sound like waffle?
Yeah. And the other aspect about epistemes, it's a slightly different point I'd make now, is that what we tend to think of as natural is so culturally specific. And this is why there's kickback from people, because you're immediately accused of being a moral relativist if you point out that different cultures experience the world differently, because then they say, oh, well, you're saying there's no truth. And no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is truth is more culture specific than people realize. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm just describing how it is. And if I can give you a quick example.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's a dark example because, hey, I'm giving the example. But I would suggest that nowadays, I'm trying to think of something that the vast majority of your viewers would all accept is wrong. And an obvious thing would be paedophilia. So I'm struggling to think of many people who'd actively try and defend that. But you get into, I was reading a book about some anthropologists and it's on my shelf somewhere, I'll try and dig it out. But they were doing what's called ethnographic research in, I think it was Brazil. So that what ethnographic research means, you basically get in and live with the community you're studying. And one of the researchers was offered a 12 or 13-year-old girl as a bride. Now, from memory, they made a documentary, I believe, on it. And I think that the anthropologist was accused when he got back to France of having had a relationship with this girl. Now, I'm not defending it in any shape or form, but what I'd ask viewers to think about is, from the point of view of the girl's father, if that anthropologist didn't have a relationship with that girl, he was, in his culture, deeply, deeply offended. So if you're immersed in another culture and you're trying to study it, there's a very practical ethical question. Do you have a relationship with a 12 or 13-year-old girl? Or do you say, I'm going to use my French ethical standards of the 20th century? At the time, it was a 20th century anthropologist. Now, I just think that's a fascinating question, because if you don't accept the girl as a gift from this father, well, you are definitely applying what in modern terms, what would be called colonialist attitudes.
I'm laughing because, well, there's two reasons. One is I can see you really disrupting dinner parties with this one. and the second one is, like, one of the themes we've touched on a couple of times today is regression. And there are now people in our world, in our, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say it, episteme or just episteme? Episteme, who are trying to bring it back, and they're saying, oh, they're not pedophiles, they're MAPs, minor attracted persons. They're trying to take us backward. And I always think, like, like you said, there's many things that we think of as being natural.
But the difference I'd argue there is that those people who call themselves MAPs or whatever, they're trying to create a situation within an existing culture that is deeply, deeply prohibitive to that act.
Yes.
Whereas,
of course.
But it's an important distinction. Whereas the father of the tribal girl is acting completely within his culture.
100%. You mentioned naturalness, and there is such a thing as the natural fallacy. So what our sense of what is natural in this culture is in fact absurd. Like what we think, oh, that's natural, this is natural, that's artificial. It's fucking absurd. And then when you get down to it, I gave this a couple of weeks thought. Well, you could argue that the worst things like genocide is natural. Things that I shouldn't mention on YouTube are natural. Let's say sexual assault en masse, like systemized sexual assault, is there in nature. Does that make it natural? But it's not. That doesn't make it something. In fact, we should do away with the idea that judging things as being natural or not is a yardstick for whether we should do them or not do them. And this is an argument, by the way, the ancient Greeks resolved thousands of years ago. They'd already gone way past this. They'd be appalled if they knew that like 2,000-3,000 years later, we had to go back and revisit.
But you know, I'm just sorry, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about your map reference, because it actually, I think, fits my argument. Because I'm arguing that because we live in post-literate times, we've regressed in certain ways. And that would explain why that phenomena, I would argue, why that is happening. And the reason I say that is, back to the baby, the mirror image. When the baby, after the mirror stage, when the baby becomes immersed and learns language. And in French, I think there's I think it's called a homophobic. It's not homophobic, a homophonic joke, or not joke, but there's a pun. The idea is that the baby learns. It's closest to its mother traditionally. It's being breastfed, so it's got a close bond with the mother. So when it gets its sense of self-identity, part of that identity construction is it realizes, this is the whole Oedipal stuff, which I won't go into, but there's a father figure, a paternal father figure that is a figure of authority. Now in Lacan, the father figure, there's loads of complex gobbledygook jargon, but essentially the father figure gets to represent the symbolic world of language. So there are 3 stages in Lacan that I'll explain really simply as I can. There's the imaginary, and that's the baby looking in the mirror. It's the baby isn't imagining what it can see. It's not imaginary in that sense, but the idea that the baby is a self-contained, complete entity is imaginary, because it's not. It's a figure in the world that's going to have to engage in lots of complex things. So the imaginary in Lacan is arguably, it's the pre-verbal, it's the image-based, and it's the excessively simple. The symbolic in Lacan is when you enter the realm of language and all its complexities, all the symbols that language creates. And this is the argument I'm making with reference to what you just said about maps. I would argue they're in the pre-verbal stage, where they're attracted to kids and they're trying to justify it.
100%.
But they don't have a rational argument. It's basically, I see, I want. That is the imaginary. That's the baby stage. When you enter the symbolic realm, that's when things get more complicated, because you actually have to offer arguments. And in Lacan, the homophonic pun is it's called le nom de père, the name of the father, N-O-M, le nom de père is the name of the father. And that is the representation of the symbolic realm where language exists. But also it sounds like le nom de la père, the no of the father. No. But interestingly, this is what, in a traditional nuclear family, the father's role is. The father is the symbolic figure who represents language and society, who says no.
Thou shalt not.
Yeah, and that's as a young growing individual, that's how you learn your place within the symbolic order. Now, what I'm saying is that we live in the media and the circularity of Narcissus. I'm arguing that's the pre-verbal imaginary stage that we're not leaving.
Yeah.
And the symbolic realm of language, le nom de la père, the no of the father, being told you can't do something, that's what's largely absent in our society.
Because of a lack of reading, a lack of literacy, which has led to a lack of rational thought.
Well, the point is, how do we position ourselves? When I was talking about Sartre, other people seeing us, this as we enter the symbolic realm, it brings great complexity, but it's what makes us fully human. If you want to be more developed than a child or Narcissus, you have to engage with language.
Yes.
But everything I say, Boston, Echo, Baudrillard, everything they're saying negatively about the media is the point that you're in this circular loop where images dominate.
Yeah.
And the board has lots of quotes about the image, and so does Boston. But what they're basically saying is the image is what it is. An image doesn't really provide a cogent argument.
Yeah.
Well, especially, actually, I should specify images within the media. So photographs, videos. We'll look eventually, if we ever get there, we'll look at, when we look at Las Meninas, because that's a painting. Interestingly, I'd argue paintings are different. And one of the distinctions I'd make is if I asked you the difference between a sign and a symbol, would you be able to distinguish them?
A sign is more linguistic than a symbol. It's more developed. A symbol could be more primitive than a sign.
Yeah, or I would argue a sign is basically, it can be arbitrary. So in linguistics, the fact that we have all these different languages and they'll all have a different word for the same object. Language isn't arbitrary, and you need rules, and everyone has to accept within that language that le père means father.
Yeah.
But I'd say father, a French person would say le père. So it's arbitrary, but the arbitrariness, once it's established, has significance. But a symbol has more depth. So a very practical way is if I said to any of your viewers, the golden arch of McDonald's, the world recognized yellow M. If I said, how long could you speak about that M for intelligently? I'm guessing most people would be stuck after. Someone like me could probably talk about 3 days because I've got verbal diarrhea. But most people, would you accept or agree that most people would struggle to talk for any length of time about the McDonald's sign?
I'd be amazed if they could say more than a few words.
Yeah, the one way into it might be to talk about you see, this is it. The only way I could talk about the M sign in a lot of detail would be to say it's a symbol of capitalism.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the point I'm trying to make. A symbol, if you said to me, showed me the Islamic crescent or the Star of David or a crucifix, I could talk for months. Why? Because those symbols are laden with cultural meaning. Whereas the meaning behind a sign is very, very shallow. Why is it shallow? It's not coincidental. It's shallow because it's ultimately transferable and consumable. The McDonald's burger is instantly recognizable because it can be consumed all around the world. Why can it be consumed all around the world? Because it's the same simple process reduced to an absolute minimum. Everywhere you consume it. The only difference I'm aware of is in India, it's not a great idea to have beef burgers. So the McDonald's would be a lamb burger. I believe that would make sense. But that is about it. In any McDonald's anywhere in the world, anyone would recognize what they're having. Now that is a sign. So that is a burger made into a sign. Signs are made for rapid communication. Signs circulate within the media. So a celebrity is a form of a sign in the sense it's made to be transmissible and go around in circles. A Baudrillard book is much more difficult to circulate because you have to engage with it.
Yes, there's more redundancy to a sign and more as you were talking, I realized, yeah, there's more loaded meaning with a symbol. The yin yang symbol is worth a book. Like, you could go into that. Listen, I'm worried that I've taken you off track a little bit. You mentioned desire to me 3 or 4 years ago, and then I took you in different
No, no, well,
directions.
no, actually, no, no, don't panic, because this is exactly where we're going to go.
Okay.
This brings us straight back to, you've got the baby and the mirror stage, and then it tries to learn language, and you've got Narcissus looking at himself in the pool, and Narcissus is desiring himself. And remember, last week, when I explained the original myth, Narcissus actually states he gets very frustrated that he can't split himself so that he can access himself, because he reaches through the water, and he needs distance to be able to have a relationship with himself, and he can't. That's his frustration. He needs to split from himself, and he can't. The child, in order to leave the imaginary stage where it's a self enclosed entity, it can see itself in the mirror. In order to leave that behind and enter the world of language, there's a split occurs. So this desire arises because you enter a world where you're not a fulfilled, complete entity. When a baby is attached to the mother's breast, taking on milk, it's this absolute, I'm guessing, because we can't go back to that state of mind, but I'm guessing it's absolute fulfillment.
Mm.
It's what Narcissus is seeking. So it's not really, the baby isn't really desirous or desiring because it has everything it could possibly need. But
Yeah.
why does it have everything that it could possibly need? Because the baby is pre-verbal, and the baby has no sense of its individuality. So if you want complete fulfillment, I'm sure it's a Buddhist or it's an Eastern concept. If you want true fulfillment, you have to lose all sense of individuality.
Lose all desire, lose all attachment, and lose all sense of individuality. Yeah.
And enter nirvana, or the Tao, whatever these philosophies and religions focus on.
It's all
But
boobs ultimately.
well, except this is the point. So when you enter the realm of language and
Mm.
symbols, on the one hand, what allows you to enter the adult world is language. But on the other hand, entering the world of language is what creates a lack. And I'll explain that. If you think of language, I think Heidegger called it the house of being. Let's say I use the word tree. You immediately know what I mean when I use the word tree.
Mm.
But I introduce, by using that word, a lack, because I can't describe every single tree. I can't describe, I can begin to describe a specific tree. But it's the paradox of language. What enables me to communicate with you the concept of a tree is the very thing that stops me from fully expressing to you what specific tree in all its absolute detail. If language was too specific, it would be meaningless,
Mm.
because there'd be a word for every single experience and object that you ever saw or experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds completely counterintuitive and paradoxical, but we
Mm.
can use language because language has gaps and absences. Because language doesn't describe everything, it is able to describe.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot I could say, but I don't want to take you off. I don't want to take you off
Well,
into byways and highways.
but that's the basis of desire.
Okay.
There's a lack. And the point is, desires can be fulfilled, but desire can never be met. So
Mm.
when you enter the adult world, you will never, because of the nature of language I've just described, language in its very essence has a lack of something. And you can never, using language, ever achieve complete fulfillment, because that's not what language is.
Yeah.
But if you can never achieve complete fulfillment, there'll be a lack.
Is this why you asked me about the difference between symbols and signs? Is because language is always sign and not symbol?
Well, no, it's because you can have symbolic understanding through language.
Okay.
And the point is, this is why the myths are so fascinating, I'd argue, is because you can have incredibly complicated ideas that you don't fully understand. So if someone says, I don't fully understand the Narcissus myth, I would suggest that's not really a problem, because part of the whole notion of Greek mythology is it's not meant to be fully understood.
It should be
And
incomplete.
people, yeah, because it mirrors language. Language is a lack.
Mm.
Myths on, and the point is, a tabloid newspaper story tries to be as complete as possible by being as shallow and as vacuous as possible. You don't tend to read a tabloid newspaper story and think, oh, I'm desirous of more meaning, because it is what it is.
Mm.
It'll often have an image, it'll have a headline, and it'll have 3 or 4 lines of text.
Yeah.
And this is the point: the uh, tabloid writing is as close to the media as it can be without still being writing.
Right.
And this goes back again to the what we're talking about is a media environment that people are inhabiting that doesn't encourage or foster verbal dexterity, the depth and symbolic richness of language with all the desirous elements that brings. What it does foster is the immediacy of self-evident images, self-evident people. You know the person is important because they're a celebrity. But why are they important? Because they're a celebrity. But what have they
Mm.
done? Well, they are who they are. Who they are. Celebrities are tautologies in human form. But we live in a society where celebrities are incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you want to make it controversial, anyone based in Britain, we have this football ex-footballer, media pundit. He does football commentary called Gary Lineker. And I'm sure in America, you'll have celebrity sports people who comment on everything that isn't sport. And I don't even have to go into the details of basically Gary Lineker disagreed with government policy. And it became a massive news story because sports presenters came out in support of him and threatened they didn't have one of the biggest football programs in the country. And in irrespective, my point would be, irrespective of the substance of the argument, government policy is being discussed in terms of a celebrity who was famous for playing football. Now, that is quite a profound diminution of public discourse.
Yes. Yes.
And people can get all upset saying, "Oh, I like Gary Lineker." Well, great. But it's not about. That's my point. It's not. It shouldn't be about Gary Lineker. It should be about the substantial aspects of the issue at hand. And as the media went with the story in Britain, it was all about what Gary Lineker was doing and what Gary Lineker was thinking. The actual origins of the story based upon a specific government policy was never discussed. So everyone knows everything about Gary Lineker and how he feels. No one knows anything about the original thing he said that upset everyone, and why what he said in a certain context was inappropriate, because that's left well behind. The substance, the symbolic depth of communication is sacrificed for the superficiality of recognition.
Interesting. Interesting. Speaking of images, I know that I'm just keeping one eye on the time. There's an image that you wanted us to look at today, which is
Yeah, sure.
called Las Meninas. Should I pull that up?
Yeah, please do. How long do you want to? Because we can do this again another time. We can introduce it and then develop it later.
Yeah, we could do that. We could do that. I've got about another 10 minutes of juice uh on the memory card.
I'm like the battery killer, aren't
Yeah. Let's see.
I? I
So
suggest we just introduce it, and
Okay.
then we'll do a full session on it, because then I can relax and go into loads of depth and be very specific.
Yeah. Is Las Meninas on screen for you? No.
No, not yet.
And now they
Yes, it
are
is.
the girls, the maids of honor, Las Meninas. I was a bit confused when we first discussed this because I've only ever heard menina being used in Brazilian Portuguese to describe girls, but apparently it was in Spain at one time.
Right, I said earlier I'm not an art historian, and there's a great fascinating art historical details about this, but I'd rather not go into it. And I think it would be better just to talk about what's unusual about it. So, could I ask you your initial response to it?
Um, well, I feel as the viewer of this, like I've walked into a room and interrupted something.
Yeah,
I'm being looked at by one, two, three, four, five of the people here seem to have, and they're curious. They're looking at this like I just walked into the room, based on the expressions on their faces.
yeah. And it's almost got like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's almost like a snapshot, isn't it?
Yes, it does have a photographic quality. It's a moment
Which,
caught in time.
yeah, I didn't. I said I wouldn't go into art history, but one obvious factor that needs to be recognized is it was painted in 1656. So in Foucault's essay Las Meninas, which I'll go into forensic detail with next time. But if people want to try, what I'd ask viewers actually at this point, don't worry if you can't, because I'm going to go into it in forensic explanatory detail. But Las Meninas by Foucault, Foucault, is available online. And it's about 15 pages of him discussing this painting. And what I'd ask is try and read it if you can. And if you struggle, don't worry at all, because I'll explain it all. But if you can read it in advance, that would be a great help. And he's using this as an example of what you're interested in, Richard, the concept of epistemes. So he's saying this is 1656, and it coincides with roughly in that period, uh, the agenda setting, epoch defining novel Don Quixote.
Mm.
And there was a play, I think, by Pedro Calderon de la Barca, which he was born on a boat, so they called him de la Barca, from the boat. And he did a play called La Vida es Sueño, Life is a Dream. So it's a time at which, in the 1600s, mid 1600s, what Foucault argues is the episteme was changing. The classical world, where in a classical painting, you'd have a royal person being painted and you just see them, and it would be a clear representation of that royal person. What Foucault's arguing is this it's an example of how an episteme changes. So this is, rather than us, the viewer, seeing a very important person, this is much more complicated. This is much more ambiguous who's watching who.
Oh, am I being painted in this?
Well, are you? If I could
Who
ask
would
you
I don't know. I
exactly,
just realized the
this is
painter's looking at me as though he's getting information about what he wants to draw next.
for viewers of a certain age, and they'd have to be British viewers. There was a character in a soap opera called Coronation Street called Mavis Riley, and one of her pet phrases was, "Oh, Rita, I don't know."
I just don't
And
know.
and that is that. If I could do this commentary constantly in the tone of Mavis Riley, it would be perfectly fitting, because it is designed to be ambiguous, deeply ambiguous.
Mm.
And again, I would contrast this with modern media. This is a painting designed to be studied. And I will go into layer after layer after layer of it. Whereas a snapshot that is typically what's used in the modern media cannot and does not have this level of depth. So, for example, directly, what do you see in the background of that picture?
There's a man and a woman in a portrait, and then through the door, there is a man with a hat, with his hat in his hand, with a nice black cloak on and a lovely beard.
No, that's fascinating, because one thing you've said, and this is lots, I also have to emphasize for viewers that lots of this is disputed. Lots of critics have disagreed, but it is a consensus that what you call the painting in the background is actually a mirror.
Oh, that's why it's got this white
Yeah.
lines. Yes. Okay. I would. Yeah. Okay.
But I would argue it's not. I would argue it's pretty. I would argue it is a mirror, but I would also argue it's not absolutely clear it's a mirror.
It's ambiguous. It's ambiguous, except
Yeah.
for that weird little silvery sheen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. A mirror.
But that could be. Like, I would argue behind. You see the nun on the right.
Yeah.
Behind her head is what looks to me, and this is my ignorance because I haven't seen. I actually was in the Prado and missed seeing this because I'm an absolute idiot.
Oops.
But I think there's another window casement behind the nun's head on the right. So light, I think there is light shining across the back. I might be wrong about this. Apologies. I'd need to look at it more closely. But you could argue perhaps that the sheen on that, what you called a picture, what I'm saying is a mirror. You could just about, I think, argue that it's possibly just a light effect.
Yes.
But I do, most of the discussions from all the critics are premised upon the idea that that is a mirror. Now, that immediately raises the question, who's being reflected in it?
It's the man.
But so, for example, where are they? Who are the people in that mirror?
They, at a stretch, they could be the ones being painted by the painter on the left.
Yeah.
So I could be the man in the mirror. The observer, could be the man in the mirror.
That's one of the I think it's called mise en abîme, the idea that you go ever further reflections within reflections. But I've even seen it suggested. So let's do this logically. One of the accepted understandings of this painting is the king and queen, Philip IV and his queen, are being painted by Velázquez, who's on the left, the painter. And what
his name's what? Velázquez.
Velázquez.
You'll have to apologize to our Colombian and Argentinian Spanish followers for Velázquez.
No, I'm sorry. This is real Spanish. This is Spanish, not South American. Yeah. No, so I learned very basic Spanish, but I learned to ask Castellano Spanish. So I apologize to any South Americans.
I say Ibiza. I don't care how pretentious people think I am. Ibiza.
No, exactly. We want standards. So one argument is that is a reflection, and the king and queen are stood facing that mirror. Another interpretation is, as you pointed out, that reflection is of the painting that's being painted on the left. Now, what's interesting about, let's just say it's the first one. Let's say that the king and queen are standing. What makes that interesting is we, the viewer of the painting, must be standing right next to them.
Yeah, the easel would be blocking them, though. If that is the easel in the left of the screen, in the left of the shot. But yes, you're right. We would have to be standing right next to them.
Well, this is one of the interesting aspects of perspective, that they knew by this stage, they knew what perspective was, and they were very skilled in it. But painters could also play with it. So some very nerdy optical technicians have actually, I think, I need to check this, but I'm pretty sure they've checked that optically, the reflection in the mirror is actually what's on the painting. to the left. What is
That
being
would make
painted?
much more sense.
Right.
Well, it's
But would you,
mechanically to my
yeah,
brain. My brain's going, it has to
yeah,
be over there.
right. But would you accept that when you first look at the painting, it wouldn't be impossible to believe that that is a reflection of people who are standing close to you, the spectator?
Yes,
And
yes.
again, I'd argue this is what Belafqvist is doing. He's actually introducing deliberate ambiguity.
Right.
And one interesting aspect also is the easel on the left. I believe, do you see the guy talking to the nun?
Yes.
His face is quite blurry. My
Mm.
understanding is there was some fire damage of the painting. So his face had to be retouched up. So it's blurrier than it probably would have been. And I might have got this wrong, but I believe that the easel and the on the right hand side have been cropped because of fire damage. So the
Right.
easel on the left would have been even bigger.
Right.
And that I'd suggest that's unusual because a large, not a significant part of that painting is the back of a painting we can't see.
Yes, he's being very clever then. He's making a big statement about perspective. If the back there's a lot of the back of the easel here,
Yeah.
it was even bigger, then it would be much more of a challenge. It's a challenge on the behalf of the painter to the observer in terms of their sense of what they know to be true and what they know to be real.
And what I'm suggesting is also that it's not just about perspective. What having the back of the easel like that is actually Belafqvist pointing out that what you can't see is important,
Yes.
which is quite so. One of the ideas I want to develop in the next talk is the idea that actually what Foucault claims is this painting actually inhabits a space of language because this painting can be discussed in a conceptual way.
Mm.
And this is my point about symbolism. This is a great example of where images meet the symbolic realm. So this
Mm.
isn't just an imaginary, oversimplified image. This is an image that can be discussed in the realm of language.
Interesting.
And so that's one aspect. And the other second crucial aspect, I'll develop it in the next video, but one very well, it's not complicated, but it's what we've just described as ambiguous. Where everyone is looking, are those people in the picture looking at us, the spectator, who've interrupted them? Or are they looking at the king and queen who've just arrived? But if it's the king and queen have just arrived, why are the how are they being painted?
Right.
Because it looks like that suddenly the king and queen have walked in and everyone's looking at them.
And this girl is in mid curtsy. The black haired girl in the middle of the screen would be curtsying as they enter the room before anybody else had a chance to.
But even that's ambiguous, isn't it? Because is she curtsying to the girl in the middle who's the infanta, the princess? Because the girl on the left is presenting her with some flavored water
Mm.
and she's curtsying. Is the Menina on the right also curtsying? Or, like you say, is she curtsying to the king and queen? But if she's curtsying to the king and queen, that implies they've just come in, which also fits with the idea that everyone looks quite surprised.
I changed my mind about the painter, by the way. I don't think he is looking at me. I think he's looking at his painting.
But you get my point that who's he painting? Because if he's painting the king and queen who have just stood there, why are all the people acting as if they've been surprised?
Right. Right.
And from a court ethic, the idea would be you wouldn't just stare at the king and queen
No.
unless you'd been surprised. If they
Yeah.
were being painted and they were standing there in a stationary fashion, you wouldn't just stare at them.
Like this.
That would be
No.
the height of rudeness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Interesting.
point is, it's very ambiguous. Who's looking at whom?
Mm.
Who's standing where?
Mm.
what is our status as the viewer? And I've even heard it suggested that there is a mirror, because it was quite common in those days to use mirrors to paint with.
Mm,
So, what if there was a mirror in front of us, the viewer, and Velasquez was actually painting what he could see in the mirror, which is what's in the room?
right.
But then, if that was true, you would, what's the role of the mirror in the background, and what's that reflecting?
Yeah.
Is that reflecting the king and queen who have a mirror behind them? It's very complicated. It's quite unclear as to what's meant.
Well, I'm aware of the time is running
Right.
out.
Well,
Tempest fugit.
let's call it a day on that one, and then ideally the whole of the next video we could just talk about this, which will bore the pants off people.
Let's not bore people to death, for God's sake. It's going to kill my viewership if we do that. Is there anything that should we recap what we covered today just as a conclusion before signing off?
Yeah, sure.
We talked about the two different visions of Narcissus, the two versions of Narcissus, and you were making a point about the closed loop, particularly.
Yeah, I explained the closed loop of the Narcissus painting, and my analogy would then be, or the metaphor would be, that picture of Caravaggio's Narcissus embodies, in a way, the manner in which modern media provide a circular chain of images and information. That media chain of images and information is also replicated in the way commodities work. So that's why we spoke about commodities, because commodities circulate around society, and they're predictable, and they're eminently consumable, just like media images. And the implications of all this is, if my theory is correct, it's a society that's indicative of a post-literate environment. And we talked about the psychoanalytical notion of the mirror stage and how children move beyond it and enter the symbolic realm of language. But there's a countervailing force in modern society. The media is pushing us back to the mirror stage. And then we finished with looking at a painting about mirrors and how Velasquez is actually making us think about the way in which we represent the world around us. So rather than just, like Narcissus, docilely looking at ourselves and being absorbed and fixated in the pond-like mirror, Velasquez is making us look at a picture that is about how pictures are made. So it's a great example of how art can exist in the symbolic realm of language, where it can be discussed as a symbolic entity. And it's the opposite, because it's got depth, it's got complexity, it's got meaning. It's about how we construct ourselves as individuals. It's about who's looking at whom. It's about what does it feel like to be looked at by people. It's about how we interact with the world around us, which is the antithesis of the Caravaggio's Narcissus picture, which is about how we don't look at other people, how we don't interact with the world around us, and how we exist in this self-enclosed servo-mechanistic loop. And I'm arguing modern media is more Caravaggio, and reading, literature, thinking is much more like Velasquez.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Paul. I really appreciate it. Folks, if you've got any feedback or questions, please write it in the comments. If there's a specific portion of what we said, please timestamp it, help us to understand what it is you'd like Dr. Paul to answer your question about. And you can't find Dr. Paul anywhere except here in the comment section. He will be here on YouTube. He will be reading the comments and answering your questions. So, Dr. Paul, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Ladies and gents, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheers.